You keep thinking something's wrong with you. You pray and still feel overwhelmed. You fast, but the weight in your chest doesn't leave. You worship, but your tears feel stuck, like they're not allowed to fall. And so you start wondering, is this a spiritual attack? Do I need deliverance? Am I under some kind of oppression? But what if it's none of that? What if what you're calling oppression is actually just emotion finally trying to speak? What if the weight you carry isn't a demon to be cast out, but a sorrow that was never allowed to exist? There's a kind of pain that doesn't scream. It simmers. It lives just beneath the surface, quietly pulsing through your body, your thoughts, your spiritual routines. You feel it every time someone asks you how you're doing, and you say, "I'm fine," too quickly. You feel it every time you're alone with God, but can't quite bring yourself to be honest. And here's the twist you never expected. It's not because your faith is weak. It's because your heart was never given permission to feel. You were raised in a world where tears meant lack of faith, where sadness was a spiritual threat, where anger had to be rebuked, where grief had to be dressed up in Bible verses before it was considered acceptable. So you learned to suppress, to swallow, to silence everything inside you that didn't sound like strength. But that's not healing. That's emotional paralysis disguised as holiness. You didn't stop feeling because God took it away. You stopped feeling because you were taught it was dangerous to feel too much, dangerous to be too emotional, dangerous to question, dangerous to say, "God, I'm hurting, and I don't know what to do with it." So you didn't say it. You didn't allow it. You just kept showing up, thinking your way through your spirituality, never allowing your soul to be felt through it. And now, your body is bearing the cost. Because here's the thing Freud understood long before most of us ever dared to. What you do not feel, you do not heal. And what you refuse to feel, what you bury alive, doesn't die. It waits. It waits in the form of exhaustion that no amount of rest can fix. It waits in your clenched jaw during worship. It waits in your stomach every time someone says, "Just have more faith," and you want to scream, but don't. It waits in the guilt you feel when you cry, even though your soul is begging for relief. The worst part? You started calling that pain spiritual warfare. You told yourself you were under attack, when really, you were under denial. But denial has a spiritual twin. It dresses itself in scripture. It uses holy language to keep unholy silence intact. It tells you, "You're fine, you just need to trust God more." And that's how you ended up here, thinking you needed deliverance, when what you actually needed was a sacred permission to finally feel the sadness you buried because someone once told you Christians should always rejoice, to feel the grief that's been compounding every time you were told to move on too quickly, to feel the frustration that's lived inside you since God didn't answer that prayer the way you expected, to feel all of it without rushing, without explaining, without spiritualizing it away. Because real faith doesn't deny emotion. It walks through it. It sits with it. It brings it to God, raw and trembling, not because it has the right words, but because it finally knows it doesn't have to hide anymore. And maybe that's the most dangerous belief shame ever planted in your heart, that to be spiritual, you have to be stoic, that holy people don't cry, that strong Christians don't feel sad, that if your emotions are too loud, something must be wrong with your walk. But Jesus cried. Jesus sweat blood. Jesus raged at injustice. He didn't rebuke his humanity. He embraced it. He wasn't afraid of emotion. He allowed it to move through him, without guilt, without shame, without apology. So why are you still silencing your sadness in the name of spiritual growth? Why are you still trying to earn healing through emotional suppression? You think your breakthrough will come when you finally master your mind. But what if it will actually come when you finally listen to your heart? Because behind your panic is a story. Behind your rage is a wound. Behind your tears is a voice that's been silenced for years, just waiting for you to say, "You're allowed to speak." That permission is sacred. It's holy. And it may be the most powerful thing you've never been told you're allowed to give yourself. Not deliverance, not warfare, not more hours on your knees trying to cast out what you were never supposed to exile in the first place, but simply present, compassion, curiosity, to stop praying for the pain to leave and instead ask, why are you here? What are you trying to tell me? Because maybe that ache isn't your enemy. Maybe it's your invitation. You've probably been told that faith means rising above your emotion, that you're supposed to take every thought captive, suppress the sadness, ignore the anger, rebuke the fear, and keep going. Because if you're spiritual enough, those things aren't supposed to affect you, right? So when the sadness lingers longer than a worship set, when the frustration won't leave even after fasting, when the loneliness follows you into prayer, you start to panic. Is this a spiritual attack? Is my heart hardening? Why do I still feel like this after everything I've done? And the lie gets louder. You must be doing something wrong. But here's what most people don't know, that what you're calling a spiritual problem might actually be a human response. You don't need deliverance from your feelings. You need permission to stop escaping them, because somewhere along the way, you were taught that feeling too deeply was weakness, that strong Christians push through pain without letting it touch them. That maturity means being emotionally unaffected by suffering, and so you learned to suppress everything that didn't match the fruit of the Spirit. You didn't allow yourself to be sad. You thought it would open a door to darkness. You didn't allow yourself to grieve. You thought it was faithless. You didn't allow yourself to be angry. You thought it was sin. So what did you do instead? You spiritualized your avoidance. You quoted verses not to root yourself in truth, but to silence the noise inside you. You praised louder, not because you were full of joy, but because you were terrified of the emptiness underneath. You fasted not out of surrender, but out of desperation, to shut down a pain you couldn't understand. And it worked, for a while, until your body began to ache in places you couldn't name, until your chest started to tighten during prayer, until your joy started to feel forced, until your faith became more about control than communion. That's not spiritual warfare. That's emotional disconnection. And disconnection always leads to distortion. Because when you silence your emotions long enough, they stop coming to you directly. They start leaking sideways. You snap at your spouse. You isolate yourself from people who love you. You numb out with screens, food, or work. You say you're seeking God, but can't even look yourself in the mirror. And then you blame yourself again. More guilt, more shame, more striving. You cry out for deliverance, but all heaven is waiting for you to give yourself permission to feel. Because not everything tormenting you is a spirit. Sometimes it's just an emotion that's been silenced for too long. Freud warned that repressed emotions don't disappear. They return, distorted, disguised, and often destructively. The church, in trying to keep people free from sin, has too often taught them to be afraid of their own humanity. But Jesus never was. He didn't avoid grief. He wept at Lazarus's tomb. He didn't suppress sorrow. He told his disciples, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." He didn't deny pain. He felt it, lived it, embodied it, and he never apologized for it. Why do we? Why are we still trying to use spiritual language to hide from emotional truth? Why are we calling our exhaustion a dry season instead of what it really is, burnout from pretending to be okay? Why are we labeling our anxiety as lack of faith instead of what it actually reflects, a soul screaming for safety? We've confused resilience with repression, and we've dressed it up in Scripture. But God never asked you to be a machine. He doesn't want you to be strong by shutting down. He wants you to be strong by being real, by bringing your whole, messy, honest self to Him. Not the polished version, not the version that performs, the version that feels, because that's the one He can hold. That's the one He can heal. When you stop rebuking your emotions and start inviting God into them, something shifts. Suddenly, your pain isn't a threat, it's a signal. Your tears aren't failure, they're a doorway. Your frustration isn't rebellion, it's a clue that something in you needs attention, not rejection. A place in your soul that doesn't need to be cast out, but comforted. And once you begin to make room for that process, the pressure starts to lift. Not because the emotion leaves, but because you've stopped fighting it. You've stopped treating your heart like an enemy. You've stopped treating your sensitivity like a curse. You've stopped trying to numb the very parts of you that were designed to connect with the world and with God on a deeper level. Feeling doesn't make you fragile. It makes you alive. And what if that's what God is after? Not your perfection, not your emotional silence, but your aliveness, because you cannot truly receive His love if you're emotionally absent. You cannot be comforted if you've trained yourself to never feel discomfort. You cannot be known if you never show up honestly. Maybe you don't need a new spiritual breakthrough. Maybe you just need to stop running from what you're already carrying. Maybe healing doesn't come through louder declarations, but quieter invitations, like, God, I feel so angry today, and I don't know why. God, I'm sad and tired, and I'm scared to admit it. God, I miss being close to you, but I don't know how to let myself be seen again. Those aren't weak prayers. They are the beginning of resurrection, not of your circumstances, but of yourself. And maybe, just maybe, you've never needed deliverance. You've just needed permission to feel what God already sees. You were never taught how to feel. You were taught how to behave, how to quote the right scriptures, how to smile through the weight in your chest, how to walk by faith while your soul begged for a space to collapse. So you didn't fall apart. You shut down. Not because you didn't believe in God, but because you didn't believe that your sadness belonged in His presence. Somewhere along the way, emotion became taboo. Tears were weakness, anger was rebellion, sadness was shameful. You were told that if you truly trusted God, you wouldn't feel what you feel. So you performed. You raised your hands in worship, with your heart locked in survival mode. You said, Amen, while your chest tightened in silence. You fasted, hoping the hunger would quiet the grief you never dared to name. And when none of that worked, you assumed it must be your fault. But what if the problem wasn't your lack of faith? What if the real wound is that no one ever taught you how to feel and stay, how to feel and not run, how to feel without being labeled dramatic, unstable, or spiritually immature, how to feel and still be loved? We've confused emotional honesty with spiritual disobedience. We've taught people to master theology, but ignore the language of their own hearts. We've weaponized scripture to silence emotion, turning promises into prison bars. Be anxious for nothing. The joy of the Lord is your strength. Rejoice always. But when those verses are used to deny our humanity rather than meet us in it, they stop being truth and start becoming tools of suppression. And suppression is a slow kind of death. It doesn't show up all at once. It's subtle. You lose your curiosity. You stop laughing from your belly. You become numb in worship. You function, but you no longer feel alive. This is what emotional repression does. It disconnects you from your own heart in the name of appearing spiritually put together. It trades healing for image, authenticity for acceptability. And all the while, your soul is left asking a question it was never allowed to voice out loud. Am I still loved if I feel like this? The answer is yes. But no one ever told you. They just told you to keep pressing in, keep showing up, keep pretending until the feelings go away. But feelings don't leave when they're ignored. They leave when they've been acknowledged, held, heard, given space to breathe. You think you're stuck because your faith isn't strong enough, but maybe you're stuck because your emotions were never safe enough to be seen. And until that changes, nothing else will. Because faith that doesn't allow room for honesty is just performance. And God didn't call you to perform. He called you to abide, to dwell, to remain in the truth, not just about Him, but about yourself. Even Jesus didn't hide His emotions to prove His divinity. He wept, He flipped tables, He grieved, He trembled in the garden. He didn't fear the mess of being human. He entered into it. So why are you still pretending that holiness means silent? Why do you still feel like you have to earn your way into God's arms by being emotionally fine? It's not strength that makes you like Christ, it's surrender. And surrender doesn't mean spiritual passivity. It means laying down the false self you built to protect you from pain. The self that says, I'm good when you're breaking. The self that smiles in prayer but screams in secret. The The self that shuts down because feeling feels like failure. You learned to associate emotion with danger, because maybe when you expressed it as a child, you were met with punishment, or silence, or shame. Maybe you were told to get over it, be strong, or stop crying. And now, even in your most sacred moment, that inner critic still whispers, don't let it out, don't let it show, don't feel too much or you'll lose control. But what if control was never the goal? What if healing is found in letting the tears rise, in letting the anger have a voice, in letting the grief finally be named? Because once it's named, it can be carried, and once it's carried, it can be healed. You don't have to keep pretending. God's presence is not a courtroom, it's a home. And homes are where you're allowed to be human. He doesn't flinch when your voice shakes. He doesn't turn away when your theology breaks down mid-prayer. He doesn't walk out when you cry harder than you can explain. He draws closer. The emotions you were told to bury are the very doors to your restoration. And the moment you stop treating them like enemies is the moment you finally learn what peace really is. Not silence, not stillness, but integration. The sacred harmony of being fully alive, fully present, fully known. Because the more honest you are with yourself, the more space you give God to actually reach you. Not the version of you that's composed, the one that's raw, the one that's real. That's the one He's been waiting for. Somewhere in the silence between your prayers and your emotions, you began to believe that you were a disappointment to God. Not because He said so, but because the emotions inside you didn't match the picture of spiritual maturity you were taught to uphold. You didn't cry because you had hope. You didn't rage because you had peace. You didn't tremble because you had trust. You didn't break because you were strong. So every time your body responded with something human, anxiety, anger, grief, sadness, you assumed it must mean something was wrong with your faith. But what if it didn't? What if those emotions weren't evidence of spiritual failure, but evidence that your soul is still alive, still responding, still sensitive, still open enough to be affected? We were never created to walk through this life untouched. We were created to feel it all, and in that feeling, to find connection. Not disconnection, not distance, not shame. But for most of us, the opposite happened. The more we felt, the more we hid, because we were never told the truth. That emotion is not sin. Emotion is information. It's the language of your soul trying to tell you where it hurts, trying to tell you what still needs love. But instead of listening, we learned to rebuke, to suppress, to pretend, to numb, because that was safer, because that's what was modeled. We watched people in the church praise through heartbreak without ever acknowledging it. We saw pastors burn out from carrying pain they weren't allowed to speak about. We heard testimonies that only celebrated the victory and never gave voice to the valley. So we internalized a theology that said, feelings are distraction, push them down, push through. But emotions don't disappear when you ignore them. They just wait. They wait in your body, in your chest, in your gut. They wait in your sleep patterns, in your memory, in your relationship, until one day they show up unannounced, in places you never expected, like panic attacks during worship, or numbness in prayer, or explosive anger in a conversation that had nothing to do with what you were really feeling. This is not weakness. This is what happens when the soul has been silenced for too long. Freud called this the return of the repressed. He believed that what we push down emotionally does not vanish. It finds another way to express itself. And that's true not just psychologically, but spiritually, because the more you shut down what you feel, the more disconnected you become from God's presence. Not because He pulls away, He never does, but because you've stopped showing up honest. And without honesty, there is no intimacy. You think you're keeping your pain from God out of reverence. But what if reverence isn't hiding? What if reverence is showing up in your most unfiltered state? Because you know He's big enough to hold it. You don't need to shield God from your sadness. You don't need to protect Him from your tears. He's not threatened by your brokenness. He's the only one who can actually sit with it. But you have to let Him. And that means letting yourself feel, not just spiritually, emotionally. It means praying the uncomfortable prayers. God, I'm angry at you. God, I feel betrayed. God, I don't trust you right now and I don't know what to do with that. Those prayers sound dangerous, but they're sacred because they're real. And God doesn't meet the fake version of you. He meets you exactly where you are, in the heartbreak, in the ache, in the questions you were told not to ask. You don't need more discipline right now. You need permission. Permission to stop performing. Permission to stop fixing. Permission to feel the full spectrum of what's inside you and bring it into the light. Because when light hits emotion, it doesn't burn it away. It baptizes it. It transforms it. It makes space for healing to begin. But healing doesn't come on command. It comes through honesty. And honesty takes courage. Because when you've built a life around appearing okay, telling the truth about your pain feels like betrayal. Not just to others, but to yourself. You start to grieve the years you spent pretending. You start to feel the cost of your silence. You start to realize how much life you missed trying to be enough. But that grief is necessary because it leads you somewhere new, somewhere softer, somewhere safer, somewhere real. A place where you no longer have to rebuke your sadness. You can listen to it and find God waiting inside it. A place where you no longer fear your own depth. You trust it because you've discovered that your emotions aren't a threat to your faith. They're a path to it. And once you learn to walk that path without fear, everything changes. You were never meant to carry this alone. That tightness in your chest, the dull ache behind your eyes, the exhaustion that doesn't go away after sleep. Those aren't random. They're signals, messages, warnings from the soul that something sacred inside you has been trying to speak for too long, but you kept silencing it in the name of being strong. You thought that if you just prayed more, fasted longer, studied deeper, you'd be delivered from this weight. But it didn't lift, not because your faith was too weak, but because the battle wasn't spiritual warfare in the way you were taught. It was emotional abandonment, your own. There's a quiet form of self-rejection that hides beneath spiritual language. It sounds like discipline. It looks like commitment. But underneath, it's a war with your own humanity. It's the belief that your feelings are wrong, that your pain is an interruption, that your needs make you less holy. So you bury your wounds in silence, hoping they'll disappear under the surface of a well-curated spiritual life. But pain that is buried doesn't die. It hardens, it isolates, it turns the soul inward until you can't tell the difference between spiritual numbness and emotional survival. And that's when it starts to sound like this. I can't hear God anymore. I don't feel anything when I pray. I'm tired, but I don't know why. I'm not angry. I'm just tired. I'm not depressed. I'm just busy. You're not just tired. You're not just busy. You're not just losing your connection with God. You're living under emotional anesthesia and calling it peace. Because for years, you were told that faith was about not feeling, not doubting, not struggling. You were told that victory looked like being unaffected. So now, every time you feel something deeply, it feels like you're failing. But the opposite is true. Your emotions are not the enemy of your faith. They are the very place where your healing begins. Healing doesn't come from pretending you're not in pain. It comes from giving your pain a name, so it can finally be seen. And that's the secret no one told you. God doesn't heal what you hide. He heals what you bring, not the curated parts, not the memorized verses, not the I'm fine version of you, the parts that tremble, the parts that question, the parts that feel too messy to be worthy. Those are the places He wants to touch, not with condemnation, but with permission. Permission to be real, permission to feel, permission to cry in His presence and still be considered holy, permission to stop trying so hard to be a perfect vessel. And finally, allow yourself to be a loved one. Because God never asked you to be impressive. He asked you to be honest. There is no power in pretending, but there is profound transformation in presence. Your presence with yourself and God's presence with you. When you stop resisting what you feel, you stop resisting what God is trying to heal. You see, the moment you allow yourself to sit with your own sorrow, to hear what your anxiety is trying to say, to hold your anger without judgment, that's the moment you begin to return to yourself. That's the moment you stop abandoning the inner child who was silenced, the one who was told, "Don't cry, be strong, don't be so sensitive." That child didn't need strength. He needed safety. She needed space. They needed someone to say, What you're feeling makes sense. You're not broken. You're human. And now that someone has to be you, you're the one who gets to give yourself what you were never given. You're the one who gets to become a safe place for your own soul. You're the one who gets to rewrite the story. Because healing doesn't always come as a breakthrough moment. Sometimes it looks like staying with yourself, staying with your sadness, staying with your story, not to drown in it, but to redeem it. Because when you stay, something miraculous happens. You begin to feel again, and in that feeling, God meets you, not with shame, but with recognition. Because He knows the full story, the tears you never cried, the anger you never expressed, the grief you never let yourself hold. He's not asking you to be less human so you can be more spiritual. He's asking you to be fully human so you can actually receive Him. Because a numb heart can't encounter love. A closed soul can't encounter peace. A hidden self can't encounter healing. But you don't have to keep hiding. You can stop now. You can breathe. You can weep in worship without apologizing for the sound. You can tremble in prayer without needing to explain it away. You can walk into the presence of God as you are and believe that you belong there. Not because you're unbroken, but because you are beloved. And once you know that, you'll never go back to calling anesthesia peace. You'll never again confuse avoidance with healing. You'll know the difference between the silence that numbs you and the silence that holds you. Because now you're awake. Now you're alive. Now you're ready. Not to perform, not to impress, not to prove, but to feel deeply, to feel honestly, to feel fully. And in that feel, to finally be free.